Sometimes the smartest thing you can do with a toxic person is not fight them, not fix them, not even explain yourself, but remove yourself. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in truth, just in clarity. Because smart people understand something that takes others years. You don't have to announce your worth to someone who's blind to it. You just have to stop placing it in their hands. And this isn't about revenge or proving a point. It's about self-respect. It's about recognizing that you've stayed too long at a table where love was only served with conditions, where your presence was used but your voice was ignored, where your loyalty was tested but never returned. Smart people see when the space they're in no longer supports their growth, and instead of shrinking to fit, they leave. I once heard a story about a man who gave everything to people who never gave anything back. He showed up, he supported, he sacrificed, and every time he needed someone, the room was quiet. That silence became his teacher. It taught him that not everyone deserves access to you just because they once had it. It taught him that emotional proximity isn't the same as emotional safety. And it taught him that protecting your peace sometimes means breaking your own heart and walking away from people you love, but who never really love you in return. That's not an easy move. It hurts. It cuts deep, because we don't just grieve the person, we grieve the idea of what they could have been if only they'd chosen to be better. But smart people stop holding on to what might be and start making decisions based on what is. They stop trying to rewrite the story and start writing a new one where their joy, their strength, and their identity are no longer dictated by someone else's dysfunction. And make no mistake, leaving doesn't always mean slamming doors. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just a shift, a gradual pulling back, a decision not to engage, a choice to stop explaining, defending, or chasing. It's a silent reclaiming of power. It's saying, I love myself too much to keep living in emotional warfare. People may not understand your silence. They may call you cold, distant, ungrateful. Let them talk. Smart people don't explain healthy decisions to unhealthy minds. They know that walking away from a toxic person is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. It's a declaration that your soul matters, that your dreams deserve a nurturing environment, and that your future is not for sale. So if you're stuck in a toxic connection and you're afraid of what might happen if you walk away, ask yourself this: what's the cost if you stay? What's the cost to your energy, your peace, your growth? Smart people know that healing begins the moment you remove what's hurting you. And sometimes that means letting go of what's familiar so you can make space for what's healthy. And when you finally do that, when you stop explaining, stop excusing, stop negotiating your worth, you'll feel something you haven't felt in a long time: freedom. That's what smart people fight for. Not control, not revenge, just peace, just freedom, just truth. One of the hardest lessons smart people learn, and I mean really learn deep down, is that you can't keep making excuses for people who constantly choose destruction. And I'm not just talking about the kind of destruction that blows up in public. I'm talking about the subtle kind too. The emotional wreckage, the manipulative patterns, the quiet guilt trips, the constant blaming. It's that slow erosion of your confidence, your clarity, your peace. And for too long, we tolerate it because we hope they'll change, because we see their potential, because we remember who they were on their best day, and we hold on to that image like it's reality. But potential isn't the same as consistency. And the truth is, people show you who they are, not with words, but with patterns, with choices. I remember a man who spent years trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. She had a painful past, yes. She had trauma. She had reasons for why she was guarded, cold, dismissive. And every time she lashed out, he forgave it. Every time she manipulated or twisted the truth, he explained it away. She's just hurt. She didn't mean it like that. She's going through something. And maybe all of that was true. But here's what he didn't realize. Just because someone has pain doesn't mean they have the right to give it to you. Just because someone's broken doesn't mean you're supposed to be their glue. He was slowly breaking himself trying to hold someone else together. And smart people, they reach a point where they stop doing that. Not because they don't care, but because they finally understand love doesn't mean losing yourself. Compassion doesn't mean sacrificing your mental health. And loyalty doesn't mean tolerating toxic behavior. Smart people draw a line not because they're harsh, but because they've healed enough to know what they will and won't allow anymore. They've stopped falling for the cycle apology, promise, repeat. They see it clearly now. If someone hurts you and refuses to take responsibility, if they blame everyone else but themselves, if their version of love constantly leaves you confused, anxious, or walking on eggshells, that's control. And smart people stop trying to justify that. They stop making excuses for grown adults who keep choosing patterns that destroy instead of build. It doesn't mean they're cold. It doesn't mean they stop believing in people. But it does mean they stop putting their heart into hands that keep dropping it. They stop giving their energy to people who only show up to drain it. And they stop apologizing for finally saying enough. And if you've ever found yourself caught in that loop, giving chance after chance, hoping it'll be different next time, it's not a flaw. It just means you have a good heart. But a good heart still needs protection, it still needs boundaries, and it still deserves respect. Smart people eventually realize that their peace is too precious to keep offering to people who are committed to chaos. They choose to let go, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves, and that's the moment everything changes. Toxic people have a way of pulling you out of your center. They bait you, provoke you, twist your words, and then act like your reaction is the problem. That's their game. Get you emotional, get you defensive, get you unstable, because the moment you start reacting, you've handed them control. But smart people don't take that bait. They don't react impulsively. They respond with discipline. They keep their emotional thermostat in their own hands. Now, I'm not saying they don't feel things. Of course they do. They get angry, disappointed, frustrated, like everyone else. But they've trained themselves not to let those emotions drive the car. Because once you let anger take the wheel, once you let pain or ego start making decisions, you lose sight of what really matters. Toxic people win not by being right, but by getting a rise out of you. And when you explode, they sit back and say, "See, look how crazy you are." That's how they flip the script. Smart people don't give them that opportunity. There was a man I knew who used to take every insult personally, every criticism, every jab. It went straight to his heart. And that's because he was still healing from wounds that hadn't been dealt with. Every time someone pressed those buttons, he reacted, loud, aggressive, emotional. And every time he walked away feeling ashamed, drained, and manipulated. But over time, he learned something powerful. You don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. He realized his peace was too precious to be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's dysfunction. So he started pausing, breathing, reflecting. He learned that just because someone's trying to trigger you doesn't mean you have to pull the trigger. He began responding like a mountain, not a volcano. Still, strong, unmoved. He wouldn't argue, wouldn't scream, wouldn't explain the same thing for the 50th time. He'd simply say, "I hear you," and then act in alignment with his values. And that shook the toxic people more than any outburst ever could, because toxic people thrive on chaos. When you don't give them chaos, when you give them calm instead, it disarms them. When you remain grounded, measured, and composed, they're forced to face their own instability, and they don't like that. But smart people don't care. They're not playing to win an argument. They're playing to win their peace. Responding with emotional discipline doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous in the best way. Because when you master your emotions, nobody can use them against you. You're no longer a puppet being yanked around by someone else's dysfunction. You become free. Free to choose silence over shouting, distance over drama, wisdom over warfare. And if you're someone who's struggled with this, who's reacted, who's lashed out, who's felt ashamed after, it's okay. It just means you're human. But today, you can start building that discipline, not overnight, but with awareness, with practice, with choosing not to respond to the things that don't deserve your energy. Smart people know that not every action deserves a reaction. And in a world full of noise and emotional chaos, they become the ones who lead with clarity, who protect their calm, who hold on to their power, not by overpowering others, but by mastering themselves. There's something smart people understand early on that saves them years of frustration. They don't argue with toxicity, they disengage from it. They know that trying to reason with a toxic person is like trying to plant seeds in concrete. Nothing grows. You pour out your time, your energy, your sanity, only to get silence, denial, blame, or worse, twisted words thrown back at you. That's when the wise learn that silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And walking away isn't giving up, it's leveling up. You know, I used to think if I just explained myself well enough, I could fix it. That if I was calm, patient, understanding, maybe I could get through to them. Maybe they'd finally listen. But there are some people who don't want resolution. They want reaction. They want chaos. That's their fuel. And once you realize that, you stop playing their game. Well, I remember hearing the story of a man who spent years trying to have the same conversation with someone who was committed to misunderstanding him. Every attempt to talk things through turned into an argument. Every moment of vulnerability turned into a weapon used against him. And at some point he realized he wasn't talking to someone who wanted peace. He was talking to someone who wanted control. That's when he stopped talking. Not because he didn't care anymore, but because he cared too much about his own well-being to keep feeding a cycle that never ended. See, toxic people don't argue to understand. They argue to dominate. And once you get caught in that loop, it eats away at you. You start losing yourself in the chaos. You start forgetting what it feels like to live in emotional stability. Smart people recognize when a conversation is no longer a conversation, when it's become a trap, a trigger, a tug-of-war that only drags them down, and instead of pulling harder, they let go of the rope. Now, letting go isn't about being passive. It's about choosing peace over provocation. It's about understanding that some battles aren't yours to fight. Not because you can't win, but because the fight itself costs more than it's worth. Smart people know that energy is a limited resource. They don't waste it trying to teach accountability to someone who's addicted to being the victim. They don't try to fix what someone else refuses to admit is broken. And no, it's not always easy, especially when you're emotionally tied to that person, especially when your heart still wants to believe in them. But wisdom is knowing when hope becomes self-harm. And the brave ones, the smart ones, they learn to disconnect, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but but with clarity. You don't need to prove yourself to someone who's determined to misunderstand you. You don't need to justify your boundaries, your silence, your exit. You owe no one an explanation for choosing your peace. When smart people feel the storm building, they don't scream into the wind. They walk away from it. And in that quiet decision, they take their power back. Because in a world full of noise, the strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to shout. You ever notice how some people keep finding themselves in the same toxic situations over and over again? Different faces, same story. They keep getting hurt, disrespected, taken for granted, and yet they stick around. They try to reason with it, justify it, reshape it into something it's not. But smart people, they don't play that game. They set boundaries. And more importantly, they set boundaries that aren't up for debate. And this isn't about being cold, it's about being clear. There was a time in my own life when I didn't understand that difference. I thought if I was kind enough, patient enough, forgiving enough, people would change. I thought maybe the toxic ones just needed someone to show them what love really looks like. But all it did was teach them that I didn't know how to say no, that I didn't know how to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. And believe me when I tell you, when people realize you won't say no, they stop asking for permission. They just take. Boundaries are like fences around your soul, not walls, not prisons, but clear lines that say, this is my space, this is my peace, and you don't get to come in here and make a mess of it. Smart people understand that if you don't define your boundaries, someone else will. And most of the time, they'll define them for their convenience, not your well-being. I remember hearing the story of a man who used to give and give to everyone, friends, family, co-workers, it didn't matter. He had a heart bigger than a mountain, and people knew it. But what they didn't know, or maybe didn't care about, was the toll it was taking on him. He was exhausted, bitter, drained, until one day he snapped, not out of anger, but out of clarity. He looked at his life and realized the people he was bending over backward for wouldn't even step forward for him. That's when everything changed. He drew a line, not to be cruel, but to survive. It's not easy. Some people won't like it when you start setting boundaries, especially the ones who benefited from you not having any. They'll call you selfish. They'll call you cold. But let them talk. Because the moment you stop letting people walk all over you, you start walking in your own direction. That's when you get your power back. And I know it sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things you'll ever do, especially if you've spent your life being the fixer, the peacemaker, the one who holds everything together. But hear me, your job is not to make everyone else comfortable at your own expense. Your job is to protect the peace you've worked so hard to build. So when toxic people come knocking, smart people don't invite them in for coffee and conversation. They don't negotiate with disrespect. They don't argue over their worth. They simply close the door, not with hate, but with strength. Because once you know your value, you stop offering discounts. You know, it's an interesting thing. How many people walk around every day feeling confused, even ashamed for how they're treated by someone in their life? They try harder, they give more, they bend until they break, thinking maybe the problem is them. But let me tell you something I've learned over the years. Smart people don't absorb the poison. They recognize it early. They don't let toxic people twist their peace into a puzzle. And that's not something they were born with. That's something they learned through pain, through failure, through the long nights of wondering why their kindness was being used against them. There was a man I used to know. He grew up with the odds stacked against him. Born in an abandoned building, labeled educable, mentally retarded in school, failed again and again, not just academically, but emotionally. People didn't just doubt him, they dismissed him. And when you grow up in an environment like that, you start to think the mistreatment is your fault. That maybe you're the one who needs to work harder to earn love. Maybe you're the one who deserves less. That was his story for a long time. But the turning point came when he stopped trying to decode the minds of those who were set on misunderstanding him. He started recognizing the signs. He stopped looking at their behavior as a reflection of his value and started seeing it for what it was, a reflection of their inner battles, their bitterness, their own toxic cycles. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. It's not. It takes courage to look at someone and say, this isn't love, this isn't loyalty, this is control, manipulation, a quiet kind of poison, and that poison often comes in friendly forms. It shows up with charm, with laughter, with promises that always lead you in circles. Smart people learn to watch, not just for what someone says, but how they consistently make them feel. You can't afford to keep second-guessing your instincts because someone paints their red flags green with sweet words. At some point, you've got to trust your discomfort. You've got to learn to see clearly, because clarity, true clarity, is what stops the cycle. Once you see that a person keeps hurting you, not accidentally, but habitually, once you see that the drama only shows up when they do, once you catch yourself explaining the same pain to the same person over and over again, it hits you. They're not confused, they're consistent. And when that awareness clicks into place, it changes everything. And that man I told you about, he went from believing he was broken to becoming one of the most powerful voices of encouragement the world's ever heard. Not because he begged people to understand him, but because he stopped giving power to those who couldn't. He stopped letting the poison into his bloodstream. He saw it, named it, and walked away. There's a quiet strength in that, a decision to stop taking in the poison just because it's familiar. That's what smart people do. They protect their peace like it's sacred because it is. And when you recognize the poison early, you save your future from living in recovery.